In the last video, we kind of blew through setting up a new React app using create React app, the npx package. And then we kind of went really fast through opening up Visual Studio Code and getting a running React app. And I want to kind of slow down a little bit and do a screencast that is purely about making sure everything is set up. Our IDE is set up, so Visual Studio Code is all ready to go. And we understand the difference between running React from within Visual Studio Code and then running it from just our terminal or command line on our computer. Just make sure we're crystal clear on that before we dive any deeper into everything that was created by Create React App. So let's start back off with opening our React project using Visual Studio Code. In the previous screencast, we used this command right here, the code with a dot, while we were inside of the root folder right here, my to-dos, which we can see down here, inside of here, my to-dos. We're in that directory in our terminal, and when we execute code dot, what that is really doing is it's a command that has been added to our path in our computer that the terminal understands. And code refers to Visual Studio Code. And of course, the period refers to the current directory in which we are in the terminal. So when we type code dot, really, code is an executable command that was installed by Visual Studio Code into our terminal, into the path, and then we are passing it the path to the current directory. And this, of course, would be like ~tim/dev/sandbox/my-to-dos, because it would do it from my user directory. So tim, then /dev, then /sandbox, then /my-to-dos. And then Visual Studio Code, receiving that command, would then go to that folder and open it up. So when we hit enter, really, that's what's happening. It's not magic. It's simply our terminal telling Visual Studio Code that it wants it to open this particular folder, and it passes it that folder path. So that's one way of opening up code, Visual Studio Code, from the terminal or the command prompt. And in the previous video, we saw how to go look up how to install those shell commands. And that was with a Shift Command P, and then we typed shell command, and then we received this install code command in path, and we went ahead and clicked on that, and that installed that code command into our terminal or our command prompt. All right, that's how all that happened. I wanted to be clear on that, so that way we're not confused as we move forward when we do it different ways. Another way to open that, of course, is to open up code and then do file open, and then actually going to that folder inside of your folder explorer right here. So tim, dev, and then we put it in the sandbox, and then my to-dos. You click the folder, not the files in the folder, because you want to open the entire folder as your project. So when you click open, that's going to go ahead and give you Visual Studio Code with that project opened right here. All right. Another way to do it is to do code, and if we have already opened it, we can do recent, and then we can show /dev, sandbox, my to-dos. And of course, the ~/ means the current user's directory, so /tim. So when we click on that, it'll open up that project again. All right, so now we should know how to open up projects in 3 different ways. Super useful, and we understand what that code command is, since I blew through it so fast in the last one. The other thing that we went through really quick were our npm commands right here. Now, when we learned about Node.js and we learned about npm, we learned about the scripts section of the package.json. And this is really where we can add commands that allow us to do things with the source code that we're writing. Now, when we used Create React App, it automatically created some of these scripts for us based on how the developers who created that Node npm module that was executable, that creates a folder structure and a setup for a React app, they added these for us. And there's start, which of course starts it up in our developer mode on our current machine as though our machine is the web server that's responding to HTTP requests. And it allows us to test all of our code and run our application locally and explore it in our browser. Build allows us to build the application in preparation for deploying it to a production server. In other words, when we're ready to deploy this to Heroku or Amazon or some other service like Microsoft Azure, then we would do the build command and it would create a production build for us that we could deploy to a production web server. The test command prepares and runs tests against our code if we are writing the tests. Now, if we're not writing tests, then this test command really does us no good. And then eject. Eject is one we don't want to mess with, but eject allows us to take our entire application and eject it out of this create React app setup, and then we get a fully ejected one that isn't going to be using all of these pre-setups and pre-configurations that are all done with our create React application. Rarely do I ever use this. All right. Now the rest of these, like ESLint configuration, ESLint allows us to have something that checks our JavaScript to make sure we're writing really good JavaScript, but it also extends to whether or not we are writing really good React code. And then browser list, production and development, it just talks about what browsers we plan on supporting with our React app. That's important when we get down to production and deploying our application. We want to make sure that as our application is being built, that we are being backwards compatible to the right versions of the browsers that we want to support. And then the rest of this, of course, is just your regular old NPM. The name of the app, the version, whether or not it's private or public, and then, of course, your dependencies that you have for this application. And right now, our only dependencies are React, React DOM, and React scripts. So really easy. There's a lot more behind all of this in the configuration and how this all works in order to build and create the application, which we'll get into later on when we talk about transpiling or transpilation from one version of a language to another, which we'll talk about when we talk about JavaScript and ECMAScript and the JavaScripts meeting the standard of ECMA and moving from one version of JavaScript back to another based on compatibility for these browsers that we are trying to support. All right, so the next thing we wanted to talk about was simply starting the application. Now you saw in the previous one where I hovered over this start and I clicked run script. And that, of course, just immediately for us typed the command down here in our terminal, npm run start, and it went ahead and compiled the application in development mode and then kicked up the server, the development server, and you can see that right here. It is running locally on port 3000 on our private network right here. It's going to run on 192.168.1.4 at port 3000, so that would be my machine's IP address on my local network. And so now it's running for us. Now we can stop it by doing a Control-C, and that'll terminate it. You have to do it twice, Control-C, Control-C, and that stopped it. Now that was when I just hovered over start and I clicked run script. I can also just do npm start down here, manually typing it, and you'll see that it will run the application for me. It'll pop it up in my browser, and I'm running on port 3000, identical to what happened when I just hovered over this and clicked start. Now the funny thing is that really all we're doing is we're doing the exact same thing. So if I go ahead and stop this, we're doing the exact same thing as if I were to open up the terminal and I was inside of my to-dos and I went ahead and did npm start. And you're going to see the exact same syntax that we saw down here. You're going to see that in my terminal right here, and you can see that it's running locally on port 3000. And then of course we saw that it loaded into the browser automatically for us. And we have an actively running web server right here that will listen to requests. So that's how we get our application running in multiple different ways. And it is also how we open up our code multiple different ways so that we can access the application source code and we begin to run our application and develop on it. So I'm going to go ahead and Control-C out of that, head back to my IDE, so Visual Studio Code. And if you haven't caught on yet, IDE is Integrated Development Environment. There are a ton of different IDEs out there. For these videos, we are using Visual Studio Code as our IDE. There are a ton of other IDEs out there. In fact, for my production development, I like to use WebStorm. I find it to be an extremely good IDE. It is a you have to pay for that one. It's a production enterprise grade, enterprise level IDE that isn't free. It costs money, but you get what you pay for. Visual Studio Code, for being a free IDE, is extremely good. No qualms about it. Extremely good free IDE. And we'll stick with Visual Studio Code throughout all of the tutorials, as we have done with the JavaScript and the Node and the HTML and CSS videos in the past. All right, hopefully this explains how we start up the application in various different ways, and we get to our source code in various different ways. And that should clear up any confusion that might have come from how fast I went through it in the last video.